I've always found it ironic how people judge success by the noise you make rather than the empire you build. Perhaps that's why I never bothered telling my wife Sarah about my real position in the business world, not even when she'd come home from her prestigious job at Thompson Development Group, laughing about how her company would never work with small-time contractors like me. Little did she know, I wasn't just another construction manager. I was the silent owner of Rivera Enterprises, and we were about to acquire her entire company. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Looking back, I should have seen the signs earlier. The subtle disdain in Sarah's voice when she'd introduce me at corporate parties, the way she'd quickly change the subject when her colleagues asked about my work. "Oh, Robert just manages construction projects," she'd say, waving her hand dismissively as if swatting away an annoying fly. The irony of her dismissal never failed to amuse me, even if it stung a little. The truth was far more complex than she could imagine. While she saw me as a simple construction manager, I had spent the last 15 years building Rivera Enterprises into one of the most formidable real estate development companies on the East Coast. We operated differently from other developers. Quiet, efficient, and completely under the radar. No flashy announcements, no pompous press releases, just solid results and strategic acquisitions that few people connected to us. Our corporate structure was intentionally complex, with subsidiary companies operating under different names. I preferred it this way. It kept our competitors guessing and allowed us to move freely in the market. When we acquired properties or smaller companies, we did it through various shells and holding companies. The strategy had served us well, helping us build a portfolio worth billions without drawing unnecessary attention. Sarah and I met 6 years ago at a charity gala. Back then, she was already climbing the corporate ladder at Thompson Development Group, one of our main competitors. I never lied to her about my work. I did manage construction projects after all. I just never mentioned that I managed them, because I owned the company. When we got married 2 years later, I considered telling her everything, but by then her attitude toward my simple job had become so condescending that I decided to wait and see if she could appreciate me for who I was, not what I owned. She never did. Instead, her disdain grew stronger with each passing year. Every dinner party became an exercise in humility, as she'd showcase her latest achievements while portraying me as her charity case. "Robert's doing his best," she'd say, patting my hand, with fake sympathy. "Not everyone can handle the pressure of high-stakes development like we do at Thompson." The dinner parties were the worst. Sarah would invite her colleagues from Thompson Development, executives, project managers, and developers, all of them unaware that most of their recent project bids had been quietly outmaneuvered by my company's subsidiaries. They'd sit at our dining table discussing their foolproof expansion plans, while I nodded politely, knowing that Rivera Enterprises had already secured the properties they were targeting. I maintained my silence through it all, partly out of principle and partly out of curiosity. I wanted to see how long it would take Sarah to look past the surface, to show genuine interest in my work beyond its perceived status value. But as months turned into years, her behavior only worsened. She started treating our marriage like another one of her development projects, something she could manage and control according to her vision. The turning point came during last year's real estate forum. Sarah's company, Thompson Development, was presenting their ambitious 5-year expansion plan. I sat in the audience, watching as their CEO confidently announced projects that would never materialize, because Rivera Enterprises had already quietly secured the key properties through our network of subsidiaries. Sarah stood proudly beside her boss, occasionally throwing condescending glances my way, absolutely certain that her company's success was untouchable. What she didn't know was that while she'd been climbing Thompson's corporate ladder, I'd been orchestrating the biggest acquisition in our company's history. Rivera Enterprises had been systematically purchasing Thompson Development Group's debt, positioning ourselves for a complete takeover. The plan had been in motion for months, executed through such a complex web of subsidiaries that even Thompson's best financial analysts hadn't noticed the pattern. I kept this knowledge to myself as I watched Sarah revel in her perceived superiority. Each morning she'd leave for work with a patronizing, "Have a good day, honey," as if my day of managing construction couldn't possibly compare to her important executive meetings. Little did she know that most of those meetings were about trying to compete with my company's strategic moves in the market. The cruel irony of our situation wasn't lost on me. Every night over dinner, Sarah would complain about the mysterious competitor that kept outmaneuvering Thompson Development Group. "Some big-shot developer keeps swooping in and grabbing our target properties," she'd fume. "If I ever find out who's behind these ghost companies, I'll personally make sure they regret it." I would simply nod, push my food around the plate, and let her vent. Sometimes, on particularly difficult days, I'd catch her looking at me with a mixture of pity and frustration. "You could be so much more, Robert," she'd say, as if my lack of status in her eyes was a personal failure. "Thompson is always looking for ambitious people. I could put in a word for you, help you move up from just managing construction sites." I let her believe what she wanted to believe. After all, actions speak louder than words, and very soon my actions were going to shake her perfectly ordered world to its core. The acquisition papers were ready, the financials were aligned, and Thompson Development Group was about to learn that the quiet player they'd never noticed was about to become their owner. As I sat in my home office that evening reviewing the final acquisition documents, I couldn't help but wonder how Sarah would react when she discovered that her small-time contractor husband had been the mysterious force behind her company's biggest challenges. The truth was about to come out, and it would redefine everything she thought she knew about success, ambition, and the quiet power of building something substantial in silence. The cracks in our marriage started appearing more frequently as Thompson Development Group faced increasing pressure from my company's strategic moves. Each setback at her workplace seemed to amplify Sarah's disdain for what she perceived as my lack of ambition. The tension in our household had become almost unbearable, but the real storm was still brewing. It started one morning over breakfast as Sarah aggressively scrolled through her phone, her coffee going cold beside her. "We just lost another major development deal," she snapped, not even looking up at me. "Some mystery company swooped in and acquired the Riverside District properties right from under us. Do you have any idea what this means for our quarterly projections?" I took a sip of my coffee, maintaining my composure. Of course I knew. I had personally overseen that acquisition through one of Rivera Enterprises' subsidiary companies. The Riverside District was a crucial piece in our larger development strategy, and Thompson's interest in it had only confirmed its value. "Maybe your company needs to be more aggressive in their approach," I suggested mildly, knowing full well that Thompson Development Group's traditional tactics were no match for our carefully orchestrated strategic moves. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes blazing with contempt. "Oh, that's rich coming from you, Robert. What would you know about high-stakes real estate development? Your biggest decision this week was probably choosing which shade of beige to paint some budget apartment complex." I absorbed her words silently, remembering the 3-hour board meeting I'd led yesterday, where we'd finalized plans for a $500 million mixed-use development project. The same project that would compete directly with Thompson's flagship development if their company survived our upcoming acquisition. "You know what your problem is?" Sarah continued, warming to her theme. "You lack vision. You're content with your small-time contracting work while real developers are out there shaping the future of this city. Do you know what people at my office call guys like you? Ground-level lifers, because you never rise above ground level in construction management." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony of her statement almost made me laugh. Just last week, I had signed off on the architectural plans for what would become the city's tallest building, a project that would reshape the skyline she was so proud of working in. But I held my peace, letting her continue her tirade. I mean, look at this. She gestured at her phone. Thompson is losing millions because of these shadow companies buying up prime real estate. We're talking about sophisticated corporate strategy here, something way beyond your scope of understanding. God, sometimes I wish you could just see how small your world is compared to what I deal with. The mounting pressure at Thompson was clearly taking its toll on her. Their stock had been quietly declining for months as my company systematically acquired key properties and projects. Sarah's team was working overtime trying to identify the mysterious competitor that kept outmaneuvering them, not realizing the answer was sitting across their VP's breakfast table every morning. Maybe things will turn around, I offered, knowing they wouldn't, at least not under Thompson's current management. Turn around? Sarah laughed bitterly. You don't get it, do you? This is corporate warfare. Someone out there is deliberately targeting us, and they're doing it through this incredibly complex network of shell companies and subsidiary corporations. It's brilliant, actually, she admitted grudgingly. Frustrating as hell, but brilliant. I felt a small surge of pride at her inadvertent compliment, quickly followed by a twinge of sadness. The strategic brilliance she admired belonged to the husband she constantly belittled. The sophisticated corporate maneuvering she respected came from the man she dismissed as simple and unambitious. Later that day, Sarah called me during lunch, her voice tight with tension. Robert, I'm going to be late tonight. We're having an emergency board meeting about all these lost acquisitions. Not that you'd understand the implications, but this is serious. Don't wait up. I murmured an acknowledgement, then returned to my own emergency meeting, finalizing the details of Thompson Development Group's acquisition. The paperwork was almost ready. The financial arrangements were in place, and soon, very soon, Sarah would understand exactly how much I understood about corporate strategy. That evening, alone in our oversized house, I reviewed more acquisition documents while Sarah attended her crisis meeting. The television murmured in the background, providing white noise, as I examined the complex web of companies and properties that would soon bring Thompson Development Group under Rivera Enterprises' control. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Having dinner with the executive team. We're strategizing how to handle this market crisis. Try not to burn the house down making dinner for yourself. I ignored her condescending tone, focusing instead on an email from my CFO confirming that our latest moves had successfully driven Thompson's stock price down another 3 points. Everything was proceeding according to plan, though the human cost of this corporate chess game was becoming increasingly apparent in my own home. Sarah finally returned close to midnight, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floors. She found me in the living room, seemingly absorbed in a construction magazine, but actually reviewing acquisition projections on my tablet. "You wouldn't believe the day I've had," she announced, dropping her designer bag on the coffee table. "Our biggest development project is falling apart because these mystery buyers keep snapping up all the adjacent properties. The board is in panic mode, but I guess I shouldn't bore you with the complexities of high-level real estate development." The dismissive wave of her hand as she said this perfectly encapsulated how she viewed me, not as an equal partner in life, but as someone too simple to understand her world. The fact that I was orchestrating the very crisis she was facing would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said quietly, knowing that by this time next week, Thompson Development Group would be under entirely new management. Sarah poured herself a generous glass of wine. and sank into the armchair across from me. You know what's really infuriating? Whoever's behind this takeover attempt, and yes, we finally figured out it's a coordinated takeover attempt. They're absolutely brilliant. The way they've structured their acquisitions, used subsidiary companies, manipulated market positions. It's like watching a masterclass in corporate strategy. I nodded, letting her continue her unknowing praise of my business acumen. The situation was reaching a boiling point, and soon everything would change. The pressure was building day by day, and I could feel we were approaching the moment when the truth would have to come out. The real estate development world was about to be shaken by one of the biggest acquisitions in recent history, and my wife, the proud VP of Thompson Development Group, had no idea that her simple husband was the mastermind behind it all. As I watched her sip her wine and complain about the mysterious business genius outsmarting her company, I wondered how much longer I could or should maintain this facade. The event that finally shattered our carefully maintained equilibrium happened during Thompson Development Group's annual charity gala. It was an extravagant affair held at the Grand Plaza Hotel, ironically, a property secretly owned by one of my subsidiary companies. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for this evening, viewing it as her chance to shine in front of the industry's elite. I stood in our bedroom, adjusting my tie, when Sarah emerged from her closet in an elegant black dress, her expression already set in the condescending smile I'd grown so familiar with. Remember, Robert, this is a sophisticated crowd. Try not to talk too much about construction sites and concrete mixing. Just smile and stick to small talk. Her words stung more than usual, perhaps because I knew what was coming. In less than 48 hours, Rivera Enterprises would announce its acquisition of Thompson Development Group. The paperwork was signed, the press releases drafted, and the transition teams were ready. Tonight would be the last time Sarah would stand in that ballroom feeling superior to her simple husband. The gala was in full swing when we arrived. The city's real estate elite mingled under crystal chandeliers, discussing property values and market trends, while servers circulated with champagne. Sarah immediately gravitated toward her executive team, leaving me alone at the edge of the crowd, exactly where she preferred to keep me. I watched as she worked the room, her fake laugh echoing across the marble floors. Occasionally, she'd glance my way, making sure I wasn't embarrassing her by talking too much about my modest construction work. Little did she know that most of the major developers in the room had already done business with me, though they knew me only through corporate attorneys and shell companies. The breaking point came during dinner. I was seated at a table with Sarah and several Thompson executives, including their CEO, William Harrison. The conversation revolved around their mysterious competitor and the company's declining market position. "It's like fighting a ghost," Harrison complained, swirling his wineglass. "Every time we identify a target property, it's already been acquired by some subsidiary we've never heard of. Our stock price is taking a hit, and our shareholders are getting nervous." Sarah jumped, eager to showcase her expertise. "We're implementing a new aggressive acquisition strategy," she announced proudly. "No more mystery companies swooping in to steal our opportunities." She cast a dismissive glance my way before adding, "Of course, some people at this table might not grasp the complexities of what we're discussing." The table fell silent for a moment, her colleagues uncomfortable with her obvious disdain, but Sarah was just warming up, the stress of recent weeks and several glasses of wine loosening her tongue. "You know, Robert," she continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "maybe you should pay attention. You might actually learn something about real estate development beyond hammering nails and pouring foundations. This is how the big boys play." I set down my fork, something inside me finally snapping. The years of condescension, the constant belittling, the assumption that I couldn't possibly understand her world. It all crystallized in that moment. "Actually, Sarah," I said quietly, "I understand more than you think about corporate strategy and acquisitions." She laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that drew attention from nearby tables. "Oh, please, don't embarrass yourself, honey. Just last week you were excited about managing a small apartment renovation. You really don't need to pretend you understand what we're dealing with here." The CEO shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But Sarah was on a roll now, the pressure of recent weeks finding its release in humiliating her husband. "Let me break it down for you in simple terms," she continued, her voice rising. "Thompson Development Group is facing a sophisticated corporate takeover attempt. Someone is systematically acquiring properties and assets through a complex network of shell companies. It's brilliant, calculated, and completely beyond your comprehension level." I looked around the table at the faces of people who would soon be working for me and made a decision. The announcement wasn't scheduled until Monday, but Sarah had finally pushed too far. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice calm but firm. "It is a brilliant strategy. I should know. I designed it." Sarah's laugh faltered slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Rivera Enterprises," I said simply. "The parent company behind all those mystery acquisitions. I founded it 15 years ago. Those subsidiary companies you've been tracking, they're all mine, and as of Monday morning, Thompson Development Group will be too." The silence that fell over the table was absolute. Sarah's wine glass froze halfway to her lips, her face draining of color. CEO Harrison's fork clattered against his plate as the implications of my words sank in. "That's not—" "You're not," Sarah stammered, her composed facade cracking. "You're a construction manager." "I manage construction projects because I own the companies that build them," I replied. "Rivera Enterprises owns 4 major development companies, 12 construction firms, and by Monday morning we'll own Thompson Development Group too. The papers are already signed." Harrison's face had gone pale. "You're Robert Rivera?" "The Robert Rivera." I nodded, watching as Sarah's world imploded. Her hands began to shake as she realized that every dismissive comment, every condescending remark, had been directed at the very person orchestrating her company's acquisition. "All this time," she whispered, her voice trembling, "every time I complained about losing properties, about being outmaneuvered, it was you." "I tried to tell you years ago," I said quietly. "But you were so convinced you knew exactly who and what I was, you never bothered to actually ask. You were too busy looking down on me to see what was right in front of you." Sarah pushed back her chair abruptly, the screech of metal against marble cutting through the tension. Without a word, she stood and fled the ballroom, leaving her stunned, colleagues staring after her. The CEO cleared his throat. "I assume we'll be discussing transition details on Monday?" I nodded, standing up. "My team will be in touch first thing." I placed my napkin on the table and headed for the exit, leaving behind a table of shell-shocked executives trying to process that the simple construction manager they'd been dismissing all evening was about to become their boss. I found Sarah in the hotel lobby, pacing frantically, her perfect composure shattered. When she saw me, her eyes were wild with a mixture of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. "How could you?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "How could you let me go on making a fool of myself all these years?" "I didn't make you look foolish, Sarah," I replied calmly. "Your own assumptions and prejudices did that. I never lied about what I did. You just decided that managing construction projects meant I was beneath you. You never once showed genuine interest in my work or bothered to look beyond your preconceptions." She stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, the full weight of her years of condescension crashing down around her. The proud VP of Thompson Development Group was finally facing the reality that her simple husband had orchestrated one of the biggest real estate acquisitions in the city's history, and she'd never even suspected. The drive home from the gala was silent, thick with unspoken words and shattered perceptions. Sarah stared out the passenger window, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her designer clutch. The woman who always had something condescending to say was, for once, completely speechless. I pulled into our driveway, the sensor lights illuminating our modern mansion, another property owned by one of my companies, though Sarah had always assumed we could afford it through her VP salary. Before I could turn off the engine, she was already out of the car, practically running to the front door. Inside, she immediately headed for the bar cart, her hands shaking as she poured herself a generous glass of scotch. I watched from the doorway as she drained half of it in one gulp, her carefully applied makeup now smeared from holding back tears. "All those properties," she finally said, her voice hoarse. "The Riverside District, the Harbor Point Development, the Downtown Plaza project. Everything Thompson lost in the past year. That was all you." "Yes," I replied simply, loosening my tie. "Rivera Enterprises has been systematically acquiring key properties and assets for the past 18 months, positioning for the Thompson takeover." She spun around, anger flashing in her eyes. 18 months? You've been planning this for 18 months while watching me stress about work, listening to me complain about losing deals, and you said nothing? Would you have listened if I had? I asked quietly. When was the last time you showed any genuine interest in my work beyond assuming it was beneath you? The question hit her like a physical blow. She sank into the leather armchair, the one she'd insisted on buying to class up my supposedly modest taste. "But why?" she whispered. "Why let me go on believing you were just a construction manager?" I finished for her. "Because that's who you wanted me to be, Sarah. You were so comfortable in your sense of superiority that you never questioned it. Even now, you're more upset about being wrong than about how you've treated me all these years." Her head snapped up, denial ready on her lips, but she caught herself. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, she actually stopped to think about her words before speaking. The silence stretched between us, filled with the echoes of countless dismissive comments and condescending remarks. Finally she spoke again, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "What happens now?" I moved to the window, looking out over the city skyline, a landscape I'd helped shape through projects she'd never bothered to ask about. Monday morning, Rivera Enterprises will officially announce the acquisition of Thompson Development Group. The press release is already prepared, the transition teams are in place, and the board has approved the sale. Your CEO and executive team will be stepping down, and new management will be brought in. Sarah's glass clattered against the side table. "And me? What happens to me?" "That depends," I replied, turning to face her. "Professionally, your position will be evaluated like everyone else's during the transition. Personally," I paused, watching her flinch at my tone, "that's up to you. For years, you've made it clear what you think of me and my work. Now that you know the truth, what do you want to happen?" She stood up abruptly, swaying slightly from the scotch and emotion. I need time to think. This is too much." She grabbed her clutch and practically fled upstairs, leaving me alone in the living room. I spent the next few hours in my home office, reviewing Monday's announcement materials and responding to urgent emails from my transition team. Around 3 a.m., I heard Sarah's heels clicking on the marble floors upstairs as she paced back and forth, probably trying to process how completely her worldview had been upended. By morning, she had locked herself in the guest room, emerging only to make coffee before retreating again. I could hear her on the phone, her voice rising and falling as she presumably talked with friends or colleagues about the revelation. Several times, I caught fragments of her conversations through the door. "How?" Was I supposed to know? She demanded to someone. He never said anything. No, you don't understand. He's not just successful, he's Rivera, the Robert Rivera, yes, that Rivera Enterprises. The whole time, no, I had no idea. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message from Harrison Thompson's CEO. Robert, I assume you'd prefer to handle the initial announcement internally before the press release. The executive team is still in shock, but we'll cooperate fully with the transition. I replied, affirming the plan, then sent a company-wide email to my own team, preparing them for Monday's announcement. Sarah must have been monitoring her work email because moments later I heard a sharp intake of breath from the guest room, followed by the sound of something being thrown against the wall. Curious, I checked Thompson's internal email system, which I now had access to. Sarah had just received the preliminary transition memo from Harrison, outlining the upcoming changes. Her entire professional world was crumbling around her, and the husband she dismissed for years was the cause. By evening, Sarah finally emerged from the guest room, her face pale, and her designer dress from last night wrinkled from hours of anxious pacing. She found me in the kitchen calmly preparing dinner, another skill she'd always underestimated. I just got off the phone with legal, she said, her voice raw. They confirmed everything. Rivera Enterprises owns Thompson Development Group. You own us. You own me. I own the company, I corrected her, not looking up from the vegetables I was chopping. Your professional future, like everyone else's at Thompson, will be decided based on merit and performance during the transition. Your personal future is still yours to decide. She slumped onto a bar stool, watching me cook with new eyes. All those times I mocked your cooking, saying a real executive would never waste time in the kitchen. You are probably worth more than everyone at my company combined. Money was never the point, Sarah, I said, finally looking up at her. Respect was, basic human respect, something you never thought I deserved because of what you assumed about my work. The truth of my words seemed to physically pain her. She wrapped her arms around herself, looking small and lost in her rumpled designer dress. When I saw the transition memo, my whole team is being evaluated. Positions are being restructured. Everything I've worked for, everything you've looked down on me for, I added quietly, every project you dismissed, every achievement you belittled, every time you treated me like I couldn't possibly understand your world of real development and corporate strategy. How does it feel to realize you were wrong? Her face crumpled, years of superiority stripped away in an instant. I was horrible to you, she whispered. All this time, while I was bragging about my corporate success, you were building an empire, and I never even noticed because I was too busy looking down on you. I continued preparing dinner, letting her sit with that realization. The vegetables sizzled in the pan, filling the kitchen with aromatic steam, while Sarah watched me cook with an expression I'd never seen before. Something between awe and shame. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. I left, early before Sarah even emerged from the guest room where she'd spent another restless night. The drive to Thompson Development Group's headquarters felt surreal. I'd never actually been inside the building, despite owning it as of this morning. The lobby was buzzing with nervous energy when I arrived. Security had been briefed about my arrival, and the guard who had probably seen me dropping Sarah off numerous times now stood at attention, quickly ushering me to the executive elevator with a respectful, "Good morning, Mr. Rivera." Harrison met me in the boardroom, along with the transition team from Rivera Enterprises. The contrast between them was striking. Harrison looked like he'd aged a decade over the weekend, while my team was efficiently setting up for the upcoming announcements with practiced precision. The all-hands meeting is scheduled for 9 a.m. in the main conference center, Harrison informed me, his voice strained. All department heads and key personnel will be present. We've kept the exact nature of the announcement under wraps, but rumors are already circulating. I nodded, reviewing the presentation materials one last time. And the executive team? They're gathering in the executive lounge, including... He hesitated. Including your wife. VP Matthews will be treated like any other executive during this transition, I said firmly, using Sarah's professional name. No special treatment, positive or negative. The executive lounge was thick with tension when I entered. Sarah sat rigid in her chair, staring straight ahead while her colleagues whispered among themselves. Many of them had been at the gala, and word had spread quickly about the dramatic revelation of my identity. "Good morning," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs. The room fell silent immediately. Before the general announcement, I wanted to speak with the executive team directly. As you're aware, Rivera Enterprises has acquired Thompson Development Group. This transition will be comprehensive and systematic. I moved to the front of the room, aware of Sarah's eyes following my every move. The confident, commanding presence I'd hidden from her for years was now on full display. Each of you will meet with our transition team this week. Your roles, responsibilities, and futures with the company will be evaluated based on merit, performance, and alignment with Rivera Enterprises' vision. No exceptions, no special considerations. One of the executives, David Foster, raised his hand. "Sir, about the Riverside District project." "The project your team lost to one of our subsidiaries 3 months ago?" I asked, watching him squirm. "Yes, that will be integrated into our existing development pipeline. In fact, many of the properties and projects Thompson has lost over the past year will now be revealed as part of Rivera Enterprises' portfolio." Sarah flinched visibly at this, no doubt remembering all the times she'd complained about those lost opportunities over dinner. Her colleagues shot her uncomfortable glances, probably recalling how often she'd dismissed her husband's understanding of real estate development. "Mr. Rivera," another executive ventured, "your reputation in the industry, the way you've built Rivera Enterprises, it's remarkable how you've managed to stay under the radar while accumulating such significant holdings." I allowed myself a small smile. I believe in letting results speak louder than words. Now shall we head to the main announcement? The main conference center was packed when we arrived. Hundreds of Thompson employees waited nervously watching as their executive team filed in, followed by me, a face many of them had seen but never really noticed before. Harrison stepped up to the podium first. "Good morning, everyone. Today marks a significant change for Thompson Development Group. I'd like to introduce Robert Rivera, founder and CEO of Rivera Enterprises, and as of this morning, the new owner of Thompson Development Group." The room erupted in whispers as I took the podium. In the front row, Sarah sat perfectly still, her face a mask of composure even as her world shifted beneath her feet. "Many of you know me," I began, a ripple of uncomfortable recognition moving through the crowd. "You've seen me in the lobby, in the parking garage, maybe even exchanged polite nods as I dropped off your VP of Operations, Sarah Matthews. What you didn't know is that while I was doing that, I was also orchestrating one of the largest real estate acquisitions in this city's history." The projector behind me displayed the Rivera Enterprises logo, alongside a map showing all our holdings, including the many properties we'd acquired from under Thompson's nose over the past year. Those mystery buyers you've been competing against, the shadow companies acquiring prime properties, the competitor that seemed to anticipate your every move, that was us. That was me. I clicked through slides showing the full scope of Rivera Enterprises operations, the developments, the properties, the subsidiaries that had been carefully hidden until now. With each revelation, I could see Sarah sinking lower in her chair, the full magnitude of her misjudgment becoming clearer to everyone in the room. "Some of you may be wondering about your futures here," I continued. "Over the next few weeks, every department and position will be evaluated. Changes will be made, but these changes will be based on merit, performance, and potential, not on past assumptions or office politics." My eyes met Sarah's briefly. She looked away first, her cheeks flushing with the memory of countless dismissive comments about my work, my potential, my understanding of real business. Rivera Enterprises operates differently than what you're used to. We value results over titles, substance over show. Everyone, from the CEO to the newest hire, is judged by their contribution, not their connections or credentials. The irony of this statement wasn't lost on anyone who knew about Sarah's previous attitude toward her simple husband. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, no doubt remembering times they'd followed her lead in dismissing me. After the announcement, I headed to what was now my office, the CEO's corner suite with its sweeping views of the city. Sarah's office was visible from here, and I could see her through the glass walls, sitting at her desk with her head in her hands. My assistant, now serving as interim chief of staff for the transition, knocked and entered with a stack of folders. "Sir, the transition team has prepared preliminary evaluations of all executive positions, including—" She glanced through the glass wall at Sarah's office. "VP Matthews will be evaluated like everyone else," I said firmly. "No preferential treatment, positive or negative. Her position will be judged solely on her professional merit." Throughout the day, a parade of Thompson executives came through my office, each meeting a stark contrast to how they'd previously interacted with me at corporate events. The same people who had barely acknowledged my existence now sat nervously across from me, their careers in my hands. Sarah, however, stayed in her office, watching through the glass as her corporate world transformed around her. The occasional glimpses I caught of her showed a woman struggling to reconcile her previous worldview with the new reality. Her simple husband was now her boss. The man she'd looked down on for years was the business genius she'd unknowingly admired. The next few days brought a storm of activity as the acquisition news spread through the real estate development community. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from industry leaders who had known me only as a voice on conference calls or a signature on contracts, now realizing that the quiet man they'd seen at events was the mysterious Robert Rivera. Sarah's reaction to the public revelation was unexpected. Rather than accepting the new reality, she seemed to swing between extremes, sometimes appearing completely broken, other times attempting to reassert her previous authority with an almost desperate energy. It started during the first major project review meeting. The conference room was packed with executives from both Thompson and Rivera Enterprises as we discussed the integration of ongoing developments. Sarah arrived last, choosing a seat directly across from me. "The Harbor Point development," she interrupted as my team was presenting, "was my initiative. I've been managing that project personally for months." Her voice carried a note of challenge, as if daring me to dismiss her contribution. I looked up from my notes, meeting her gaze. "The Harbor Point development that Rivera Enterprises acquired through subsidiary companies 3 months ago, the one you complained about losing every night at dinner?" The room fell silent. Sarah's face flushed, but she pressed on. "I know every detail of that project. The zoning requirements, the environmental impact studies, the community agreements, all of which were rendered obsolete when we acquired the surrounding properties and redesigned the entire development." I cut in smoothly. "But please, continue telling us about your outdated plans." She fell silent, the reminder of her previous ignorance hitting home. But it wasn't the end of her attempts to prove herself. Throughout the week, she threw herself into work with frantic energy, arriving early, leaving late, and pushing her team harder than ever. Sarah's becoming a liability. My HR director warned me during our daily briefing. She's demanding her team work unreasonable hours, trying to prove she's indispensable. This morning, she made her assistant cry. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Document everything. She'll be evaluated like everyone else during the transition. The situation at home wasn't any better. Sarah had moved all her things into the guest room, but her presence filled the house with a tense energy. She'd alternate between long periods of icy silence and sudden bursts of confrontation. One evening, I found her in my home office, going through my files. "Looking for something?" I asked from the doorway. She spun around, clutching a folder. "These development plans, some of these date back years. You were planning this all along, weren't you? Watching me brag about Thompson's projects while you were 10 steps ahead?" "I built Rivera Enterprises long before I met you," I replied calmly. "The fact that you never bothered to know anything about my work is on you." "You could have told me," she exploded. "All those times I talked about work, about our competitors, about the mystery company buying up properties, you just sat there, letting me make a fool of myself." "Would you have listened?" I asked quietly. "When did you ever show genuine interest in my work beyond assuming it was beneath you?" The folder trembled in her hands. I thought you were just a construction manager," I finished for her. "And that assumption gave you the right to treat me with contempt, to dismiss everything I did, to make me feel small in my own home." She flinched at my words. "I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," I cut her off. "Every dismissive comment, every condescending remark, every time you treated me like I couldn't possibly understand your world of real business, you meant every word. The only thing that's changed is now you know you were wrong." The folder slipped from her fingers, papers scattering across the floor. Without another word, she fled the room, leaving me to clean up the mess, a fitting metaphor for our relationship. At work, the situation continued to deteriorate. Sarah's desperate attempts to prove her worth began to affect the entire transition process. She started sending emails at all hours, copying me on everything, trying to demonstrate her indispensability. "Just got another 2 a.m. email from Sarah," my chief of operations reported. "She's proposed completely restructuring the Harbor Point project. Again, this is the 3rd revision this week." I reviewed her proposal. It was actually solid work, but the frantic energy behind it was concerning. She was working herself to exhaustion, trying to prove she deserved her position on merit, not just as my wife. The breaking point came during a major client meeting. We were presenting updated plans for the Riverside District development to a group of investors, the same project Sarah had lost to one of my subsidiaries months ago. She arrived early, setting up her materials at one end of the conference table. When I entered with the Rivera Enterprises team, she stood up straighter, clutching her presentation folder like a shield. "I've prepared an alternative proposal for the Riverside development," she announced as soon as the investors were seated. "Based on my previous work with the project, I believe—" "VP Matthews," I interrupted, using her professional title deliberately. "This meeting is to present Rivera Enterprises' approved development plan. Your alternative proposal isn't on the agenda." She flushed but pressed on. "With all due respect, sir," the word dripping with barely contained emotion. "I've been working on this project since its inception at Thompson. I know these properties, these neighborhoods." "You knew them," I corrected her gently but firmly, "before Rivera Enterprises acquired them and completely reimagined the development. Your experience with the original project, while noted, is no longer relevant. The investors shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the tension between us. Sarah remained standing, her knuckles white around her folder. "So my input means nothing," she demanded, her professional facade cracking. "All. My work, my expertise just disappears because you managed to outmaneuver us, because you were playing us all along." "Sarah," I warned, but she was past hearing. "Do you know what it's like," she continued, her voice rising, "finding out your husband, the man you—" She caught herself remembering our audience. "Finding out the person you underestimated was actually orchestrating everything? That every project you lost, every deal that fell through was because of him?" The room was dead silent. The investors stared at their tablets, trying to pretend they weren't witnessing this meltdown. My team waited tensely for my response. "VP Matthews," I said quietly but firmly, "you're dismissed from this meeting. Please return to your office and wait for HR to contact you." She stood frozen for a moment, the full impact of what she'd done washing over her. Then, without another word, she turned and fled the conference room. After Sarah's outburst at the investor meeting, the situation reached a critical point. My HR director was waiting in my office when I returned, her expression grave as she placed a thick folder on my desk. "We need to discuss VP Matthews' position," she began carefully. "Setting aside her personal connection to you, her behavior over the past week has become increasingly erratic. The emotional outburst in front of major investors today is just the latest incident." I sat down heavily in my chair, looking out over the city skyline I'd helped shape. "Walk me through everything." She opened the folder, revealing detailed documentation of Sarah's recent conduct. Multiple instances of sending work emails between 1 and 4 a.m. Aggressive behavior toward subordinates. 3 complaints of verbal abuse from her team members. Unauthorized access to confidential Rivera Enterprises files. And now, this public confrontation during a critical investor meeting. The evidence was damning, even without considering our personal situation. Sarah's inability to handle the revelation of my true position had completely undermined her professional judgment. "There's more," my HR director continued. "We've reviewed her performance records from before the acquisition. While her project management skills are strong, there's a pattern of taking credit for her team's work and dismissing input from those she considered beneath her position." I couldn't help but laugh softly at that last part. It perfectly matched how she'd treated me at home for years. "What are our options?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "From a purely professional standpoint, we have grounds for immediate termination. The investor meeting incident alone would justify it. However, given your personal connection, we've prepared several alternatives." She laid out 3 options: immediate termination with a standard severance package, a negotiated resignation with an enhanced severance, or a transfer to one of our subsidiary companies in another city. She'd see any of those as ultimate humiliation, I noted, remembering Sarah's fierce pride in her VP position. "With all due respect, sir," my HR director replied, "she created this situation. Her conduct since the acquisition has been unprofessional at best, actively harmful to the company at worst. We need to act decisively before she causes more damage." I nodded slowly, coming to a decision. "Prepare the negotiated resignation, a package. I'll speak with her myself." Later that afternoon, I had security escort Sarah to the CEO's office, my office. She entered with her head held high, though her hands were shaking slightly. "Sit down, Sarah," I said quietly, gesturing onto the chair across from my desk. She remained standing. "Is this where you fire me? Complete your revenge for all the times I underestimated you?" "This isn't about revenge," I replied, keeping my voice level. "This is about professional conduct and what's best for the company. Your behavior since The acquisition has been unacceptable. Unacceptable? She laughed bitterly. You orchestrated this entire situation. You bought my company, took over my projects, made me look like a fool in front of everyone. I built a successful business, I cut in. The fact that you never bothered to know or respect what I did isn't my fault. Your response to learning the truth has been unprofessional and destructive. I pushed the resignation package across the desk. This is a generous offer, full severance, extended benefits, and a positive reference for future opportunities. All we require is your immediate resignation and a non-disclosure agreement about the circumstances. She stared at the documents, her face pale. So this is it. You're really going to fire your own wife. I'm not firing anyone, I corrected her. I'm offering you the opportunity to resign with dignity. And right now, I'm acting as CEO of Rivera Enterprises, not as your husband. You've demonstrated clearly that you can't separate the personal from the professional. Sarah finally sank into the chair, her composure cracking. Everything I worked for, my position, my reputation. Your position was earned through competence, I acknowledged, but you've compromised that with your recent behavior. The late-night emails, the aggressive treatment of your team, the outburst in front of investors. It's all documented. Your personal feelings about me have affected your professional judgment. She picked up the resignation package with trembling hands. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Just like you planned the acquisition, planned the takeover, planned my complete humiliation. Sarah, I said firmly, you humiliated yourself. Your assumptions about me, your condescending attitude, your response to learning the truth, those were all your choices. I simply built a successful company and ran it according to my principles. Your principles, she repeated softly. The quiet power you always had while I was busy looking down on you. God, I was so blind. Take the package home, I advised. Review it with your lawyer, but understand that one way or another, your position here is ending. The only question is how gracefully you want to exit. She stood up slowly, clutching the documents to her chest. And what about us, our marriage? I met her gaze steadily. That's a separate discussion. Right now, we're handling your professional transition. We can discuss personal matters once this is resolved. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. You know what the worst part is? You're exactly the kind of business leader I always claimed to admire. Strategic, decisive, focused on results rather than ego. I just never saw it, because I was too busy judging you by the role I thought you had. Perhaps, I replied quietly, that's something to reflect on during your transition. After she left, I sat in my office as the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the floor. The decision to end Sarah's position with the company was professionally necessary, but it marked a final shift in our relationship. The power dynamic she had created and maintained through years of condescension had been completely reversed. My phone buzzed with a message from my chief of operations. Investors called. Despite the incident, they're impressed with our handling of the situation. Full funding approved for Riverside development. At least something positive had come from today's drama. I turned back to my computer, where Sarah's resignation package waited to be processed. The document would end her career at the company, but the real question was whether our marriage could survive the truth finally being revealed. Sarah's spiral into crisis mode began the morning after receiving her resignation package. I was in an early meeting when my assistant rushed in, her expression worried. "Sir, you need to see this," she said, handing me her tablet. On the screen was Sarah's latest email, sent to the entire company at 3:47 a.m. To all Thompson Development Group employees, by now you know that our company has been acquired by Rivera Enterprises, headed by Robert Rivera, my husband. What you don't know is the extent of the deception and manipulation that led to this hostile takeover. I stopped reading and immediately called IT. Locked down her email access. Now. But the damage was already done. Sarah had spent the night crafting a lengthy message detailing her version of events, painting herself as the victim of an elaborate deception. The email had already been forwarded beyond the company, reaching industry contacts and competitors. My PR team was assembled within minutes. "We need to get ahead of this," my communications director advised. "The story is already spreading through industry channels. CEO's wife, forced out after company acquisition, makes for juicy gossip." I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache building. "Handle it professionally. No personal attacks, no detailed rebuttals. Simple statement: personnel changes are being handled according to standard transition procedures. We don't comment on individual cases." My phone buzzed with a text from our head of security. "Mrs. Matthews attempting to enter building. Making scene in lobby. Please advise." When I reached the lobby, Sarah was in full meltdown mode, her usual polished appearance disheveled. She was waving her now deactivated security badge at the guards, her voice echoing through the marble space. "This is my company. You can't keep me out of my own office," she shouted, drawing stares from employees and visitors alike. "I've worked here for years before he took over." I approached calmly, aware of the audience watching this drama unfold. "Sarah, this isn't helping your situation." She spun toward me, eyes wild. "My situation? You mean the situation you created, buying my company, humiliating me in front of everyone, and now trying to force me out?" "You're creating a scene," I said quietly. "Let's discuss this privately." "Privately?" She laughed, an edge of hysteria in her voice. "Like how you privately planned this whole takeover, how you sat there for years listening to me talk about work, all while plotting to destroy everything I built." Security officers moved closer, but I held up a hand to stop them. Sarah needed to play this out to hit rock bottom before she could possibly move forward. "You want to know what your brilliant husband did?" she announced to the growing crowd. "He listened to me talk about company strategies, about our development plans, about everything. He used my own words against us." "Sarah," I warned, "you're emotionally compromised. Don't say things you can't take back." But she was beyond hearing. "Do you know what it's like?" she demanded of her impromptu audience. "Finding out your husband, the man you dismissed as a simple construction manager, was actually the mysterious business genius everyone feared. That every project we lost, every deal that fell through, was because of him." The lobby had fallen completely silent, everyone watching this public unraveling of a once powerful executive. Sarah's voice cracked as she continued. "I used to come home and complain about the competitor who kept outmaneuvering us. I called them brilliant, strategic, ruthless, and all the while he just sat there, letting me praise the very person I was sleeping next to." "That's enough," I said firmly, nodding to security. "Please escort Mrs. Matthews out of the building." As the guards approached, Sarah's professional facade finally shattered completely. "Don't touch me. I'm a VP of this company. She looked at me, reality seemingly hitting her afresh. I was a VP of this company. The security team gently but firmly led her toward the exit. Just before they reached the doors, she turned back, her voice carrying across the silent lobby. "You know what the worst part is, Robert? You're exactly what I always wanted to be. A true business leader. I just couldn't see it because I was too busy looking down on you." How's that for irony? After she was gone, I addressed the gathered crowd. "Show's over. Please return to work. If anyone needs to discuss what they witnessed, HR will be available." Back in my office, the crisis management team was already dealing. with fallout from both Sarah's email and her lobby performance. Video clips were circulating, industry gossip was spreading, and our PR department was working overtime. "Sir," my chief of staff reported, "we've received calls from 3 business publications requesting comments on the situation. They're particularly interested in the personal angle. High-powered executive discovers her simple husband is actually a business mogul." I sighed, looking out over the city. "No comments on personal matters. Stick to the official statement about transition procedures." Throughout the day, reports of Sarah's behavior continued to arrive. She had apparently spent hours parked outside the building, calling former colleagues and clients, trying to tell her side of the story. Several board members called to express concern about the situation. "The board is worried about potential liability," my legal counsel advised. Mrs. Matthews had access to sensitive information about both companies. Her emotional state makes her a risk. I nodded grimly. "Prepare a cease and desist order. Include a reminder about her non-disclosure agreements, both the original Thompson one and the one in her resignation package." By evening, Sarah's public meltdown had become the talk of the industry. My phone was filled with messages from business associates, some expressing concern, others barely concealing their fascination with the drama. The final report of the day came from my head of security. Sarah had finally left the premises, but not before delivering a handwritten letter to the lobby desk. The envelope, marked for Robert Rivera, the man I never knew, sat unopened on my desk as I prepared to leave for the day. My assistant paused at the door. "Sir, should I cancel your dinner reservation for tomorrow, under the circumstances?" I had forgotten about the business dinner scheduled with major investors. "No, keep it. We can't let personal drama affect business operations." That's exactly what Sarah failed to understand. As I drove home that evening, I passed Sarah's car parked near our house. She was sitting inside, staring at the home we'd shared, the life she'd built on assumptions and prejudices. For a moment, I considered stopping, trying to talk to her, but her actions today had shown she wasn't ready for a rational discussion. The woman who had once looked down on me as a simple construction manager had finally hit rock bottom. Her carefully constructed world of superiority and condescension had crumbled, leaving her facing the truth about herself and her prejudices. The question was, could she learn from this crisis, or would she remain trapped in her own narrative of victimhood? A week after Sarah's public meltdown, I received a message I'd been expecting but dreading. She wanted to meet. Not at the office, not at home, but at the small cafe where we'd had our first date 6 years ago. The choice of location wasn't lost on me. The cafe had changed little since that first meeting. Same rustic wooden tables, same oversized windows looking out on the city street, same quiet buzz of conversation. Sarah was already there when I arrived, seated at our old corner table, looking more composed than she had in weeks. "Thank you for coming," she said softly as I sat down. The proud executive was gone, replaced by someone who seemed smaller, more vulnerable. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." "I assumed you had," I replied, noting the dark circles under her eyes, partially hidden by careful makeup. "Your lawyer confirmed you signed the resignation package." She nodded, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "I didn't really have a choice, did I? After my performance last week." She managed a weak smile. "I believe the video has gone viral in certain business circles." "Sarah," I began, but she held up a hand. "Please let me say this while I can." She took a deep breath. "I've spent the past week thinking about everything, our marriage, my behavior, the assumptions I made. It's not a comfortable process, looking at yourself and realizing you've been the villain in your own story." I stayed silent, letting her continue. This was the conversation we needed to have, and she needed to lead it. "You know what really broke me?" she continued. "Not losing my job, not the public humiliation, not even discovering your true position. It was realizing that everything I claimed to value in business, strategic thinking, quiet competence, actual results over showmanship, you embodied all of it, and I was too blind, too prejudiced, too caught up in my own superiority to see it." She paused, taking a sip of coffee with slightly trembling hands. "All those times I complained about the brilliant competitor outmaneuvering Thompson, I was actually admiring you. Do you know how that feels? To realize you've been dismissing and belittling the very person you secretly respected. I do remember you calling our mystery competitor a business genius several times," I noted, allowing a small smile. "God, yes." She closed her eyes briefly. "I would come home and rave about their strategic brilliance, their perfect timing, their incredible foresight, all while treating you like you couldn't possibly understand such complex business concepts. The irony is almost painful." The waiter approached, but Sarah waved him away. She was in full confession mode now, words pouring out as if she'd rehearsed them countless times. "I've been asking myself why. Why did I assume you were simple just because you managed construction? Why did I never ask about your work, your achievements, your goals? The answers aren't pretty. I was so invested in being the successful one, in feeling superior, that I deliberately ignored anything that might challenge that narrative." "You created a story about who I was," I agreed, "and stuck to it regardless of evidence to the contrary." "More than that," she admitted. "I needed that story. The high-powered executive wife and her modest husband, it fed my ego. Every time I dismissed your work or belittled your understanding of business, I was really just propping up my own sense of importance." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, one I recognized from my home office. "I found these the day when I was packing some things, your early business plans for Rivera Enterprises. They're brilliant. The strategy, the foresight, the attention to detail, I would have admired them so much if I'd known about them at the time." "But you never asked," I said quietly. "In 6 years of marriage, you never once showed genuine interest in my work beyond assuming it was beneath you." "No, I didn't." Her voice cracked slightly. "And that's what keeps me awake at night. Not losing my job. I can find another position. Not the public humiliation. That will pass. What haunts me is realizing that I never really knew my own husband because I was too arrogant to look past my own prejudices." She spread the papers on the table, early sketches of Rivera Enterprises' corporate structure, strategic plans for acquisitions, detailed market analyses. "You built all this quietly, methodically, while I was busy bragging about my VP title and looking down on you. How did you stand it?" "I kept hoping you'd see past your assumptions," I admitted. "That's why I never confronted you about your attitude. I wanted you to show interest, to ask questions, to see me as a partner rather than someone beneath you." But I never did. She gathered the papers back into the folder, her movements careful, controlled. "Instead, I kept treating you like you were simple, unambitious, incapable of understanding real business. God, I even tried to explain basic market concepts to you, who was running a bigger operation than I could imagine." "The night you tried to explain hostile takeovers to me was particularly memorable," I said, allowing a touch of humor into my voice. "Especially since I was in the middle of acquiring Thompson at the time." She winced. "That's another irony I've been wrestling with. Everything I prided myself on, my business acumen, my strategic thinking, my market insight, you were operating at a level far beyond me. While I was bragging about Thompson's expansion plans, you had already acquired the properties we wanted. While I was explaining basic business concepts to you, you were orchestrating one of the biggest deals in the industry." Success doesn't always need to announce itself, I said quietly. Real power often works best in silence. A lesson I'm learning far too late. She met my eyes directly for the first time. I owe you an apology, not just for the assumptions and the condescension, but for never giving you the chance to be who you really are in our marriage. I was so invested in my own superiority that I made you small in my mind. That must have been incredibly painful. I nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. It was. Every dismissive comment, every condescending explanation, every time you treated me like I couldn't possibly understand your world, it all hurt. But what hurt most was realizing that you never cared enough to really know me. Sarah blinked back tears. I know it's too late, but I see you now. I see the brilliant strategist, the quiet powerhouse, the man who built an empire while everyone underestimated him. I see the business genius I admired without knowing it was you. I just wish... She trailed off, wiping her eyes carefully. Wish? What? I wish I had seen it sooner. I wish I had been humble enough to look past my own prejudices. I wish I had been the kind of wife who supported and appreciated her husband instead of looking down on him. She managed a watery smile. Mostly, I wish I hadn't had to lose everything to finally understand what I had. 3 months after our cafe conversation, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, watching the sunset paint the city, skyline in shades of gold. The merger of Thompson Development Group into Rivera Enterprises was complete, and the dust had finally settled on both the professional and personal fronts. Sarah had moved out of our house the week after our meeting, taking a position with a development firm on the West Coast. Her departure from both the company and our marriage had been quieter than anyone expected, marked by dignity rather than drama. Her final email to me had been simple: "Thank you for the lessons I needed to learn. I'm sorry they came too late." The industry had moved on from the scandal, finding new dramas to gossip about. Rivera Enterprises had emerged stronger, our successful integration of Thompson's assets proving that the acquisition had been about business, not personal revenge. The Riverside District development was proceeding ahead of schedule, its innovative design already garnering attention in architectural circles. My assistant knocked on the door, interrupting my thoughts. "Sir, the interview team from Business Leadership Quarterly is here." I nodded, turning from the window. After months of declining press requests, I'd finally agreed to one in-depth interview about Rivera Enterprises' rise and the Thompson acquisition. It felt like time to step out of the shadows, just a little. The interviewer, Jessica Chen, was professional and direct. "Mr. Rivera, your approach to building Rivera Enterprises has been unusual in today's business world. While most executives seek the spotlight, you deliberately maintained a low profile. Was that always the plan?" I settled into my chair, considering the question. Success doesn't need to announce itself. I believed in letting our results speak for themselves. The quiet approach allowed us to move more freely, to acquire properties and companies without drawing attention until the deals were done. Including Thompson Development Group, she noted, referencing her notes. The acquisition made headlines not just for its business implications, but for its personal element. Would you like to address that? The Thompson acquisition was a strategic business decision, I replied firmly. The personal connections involved were unfortunate, but didn't influence our corporate strategy. She nodded, accepting the boundary. Your management style has been described as quiet power, building success through competence rather than charisma. How has this approach shaped Rivera Enterprises' corporate culture? We value substance over show, I explained. Every level of our organization focuses on actual results rather than appearances. It's why we've retained many key personnel from Thompson, including those who initially doubted the transition. Competence speaks louder than credentials. The key. Interview continued, touching on our current projects and future plans. As we wrapped up, Jessica asked one final question. What advice would you give to aspiring business leaders about success and recognition? I thought about Sarah, about her need to be seen as successful rather than focusing on creating actual success. True power doesn't need constant validation. Build something substantial, focus on real results, and let your work speak for itself. The recognition will come naturally, but it shouldn't be the goal. After the interview, I reviewed the latest reports from our various projects. The Thompson integration had opened new opportunities, allowing us to combine their market presence. With our strategic approach, the company was stronger than ever, though I maintained our policy of quiet competence over flashy announcements. My phone buzzed with a message, a link to an article about Sarah. She had just completed her first major project with her new firm, a sustainable housing development that was earning praise for its innovative approach. The article mentioned her past position with Thompson, but focused on her current work, rather than the dramatic circumstances of her departure. I read the article with interest, noting how she credited her recent success to hard lessons about humility and the difference between appearing successful and creating actual value. It seemed she had truly taken our last conversation to heart. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave the office, my assistant handed me an envelope that had arrived by courier. Inside was a copy of Business Development Weekly, with one of our projects on the cover, the Riverside District development that had sparked so many arguments with Sarah. But it wasn't the magazine that caught my attention. It was the note attached. I drive past this project every time I'm in town. It's exactly the kind of innovative development I used to dream about creating at Thompson. You had the vision all along. I just couldn't see it through my own prejudices. Congratulations on another success. S. The note demonstrated how far she'd come from the proud executive who used to dismiss my understanding of real estate development. Her ability to acknowledge my success without bitterness showed genuine growth. Standing at my office window one last time, I reflected on how the past few months had transformed both our lives. Sarah had lost her position and our marriage, but she'd gained something valuable, self-awareness and humility. I had emerged from the shadows, not because I needed recognition, but because I could now lead openly without compromising my principles. The city lights began to twinkle on as darkness fell, each one representing a story, a dream, a possible development opportunity. Rivera Enterprises would continue to grow, but we would maintain our core philosophy: quiet competence over loud promises, actual results over empty boasts. My phone buzzed again, another message from Sarah. Just saw the Business Leadership Quarterly Interview Preview. True power doesn't need constant validation. Wish I'd understood that years ago. You're still teaching me lessons, even now. I smiled slightly, appreciating the irony. In the end, the quiet construction manager she'd dismissed had taught the high-powered executive the true meaning of success. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come wrapped in humility. As I finally left the office, I passed the Thompson Development Group logo, still visible in the lobby, despite the merger. Soon it would be replaced with Rivera Enterprises' more understated design. It seemed fitting, a final reminder that true success doesn't need to shout its presence. The security guard nodded respectfully as I passed. "Good night, Mr. Rivera." "Good night, Jim," I replied, remembering how Sarah used to barely acknowledge the staff. Another lesson she'd had to learn the hard way. Respect isn't determined by job titles or positions. Driving home through the city streets, past buildings and developments that now belong to Rivera Enterprises, I felt content. The company would continue to grow, acquire new properties, and shape the city's skyline. But we would do it our way, quietly, competently, letting results speak louder than words. After all, true power knows its own worth. It doesn't need anyone else's validation to prove its value. 1 year after the Thompson acquisition, I found myself back at the Grand Plaza Hotel, the same venue where Sarah had first learned the truth about my position. This time, I was there to deliver the keynote speech at the annual Real Estate Development Summit, something I would have avoided in the past. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood at the podium facing the same industry leaders who had once dismissed me as Sarah's simple husband. The ballroom was packed with executives, developers, and investors, all eager to hear from the man who had built Rivera Enterprises from the shadows. Success, I began, isn't measured by how loudly you announce your achievements, but by the lasting impact of your work. The crowd fell silent, pens poised over notebooks. For years, I let people underestimate me. Not out of fear or insecurity, but because I understood that true power doesn't need constant validation. As I spoke, I noticed a familiar face in the crowd, Sarah. She had returned to the city for the summit, her new firm having earned recognition for innovative, sustainable development projects on the West Coast. She sat quietly in the middle of the audience, a different person from the proud executive who had once dominated these events. The real estate industry often confuses visibility with success, I continued. We celebrate the loudest voice rather than the most substantial achievements. But lasting success, true innovation, comes from focusing on results rather than recognition. My presentation included slides of Rivera Enterprises' latest projects, including the completed Riverside District development, now a model of sustainable urban planning. The same project Sarah had dismissed as beyond my comprehension was being hailed as revolutionary. After the speech, during the networking reception, Sarah approached me. Her demeanor was professional, without a trace of her former condescension. "Congratulations on the Riverside project," she said, gesturing toward the architectural renderings displayed around the room. "It's exactly the kind of development I always talked about creating, but you actually did it." "Your sustainable housing project in Seattle is getting excellent reviews," I replied, noting how she'd taken the lessons of humility and applied them to her new role. She smiled slightly. "I learned from the best, even if I didn't know it at the time." She paused, then added, "I saw the announcement about Rivera Enterprises' new mentorship program for small construction companies. That's exactly what the industry needs." The program had been my latest initiative, providing support and opportunities to small construction firms, helping them grow while maintaining their integrity. It was my way of addressing the industry's tendency to overlook quiet competence in favor of flashy promises. We're focusing on companies that demonstrate solid results rather than just impressive pitches, I explained. There's one firm in particular that reminds me of Rivera Enterprises' early days. Excellent work, strategic thinking, but overlooked because they don't fit the industry's image of success. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "The same way people overlooked you until suddenly they couldn't anymore." She gestured around the ballroom. "Look at you now, giving keynote speeches, mentoring other companies, openly leading one of the biggest development firms in the country. Life has a way of coming full circle," I agreed, though I never planned to step into the spotlight like this. "But you're doing it your way," she observed. "No flashy announcements, no ego-driven presentations, just quiet confidence and actual results. I see now what I couldn't see before. This is what real success looks like." Our conversation was interrupted by a young developer who approached nervously, clutching his portfolio. "Mr. Rivera, your speech was inspiring. I have a small construction company, and I've been trying to get noticed by the bigger firms, but—" I recognized the look in his eyes, the same determination I'd had when building Rivera Enterprises, the same frustration at being overlooked. "Send your proposal to my office," I told him. "We're always interested in partners who focus on results rather than appearances." Sarah watched this exchange with a knowing smile. "You're going to give him a chance, aren't you? The way no one gave you a chance? Everyone deserves to be judged by their work, not their image," I replied. "That's what the mentorship program is about, recognizing substance over show." Later that evening, as the summit wound down, I found myself alone in the hotel's rooftop garden. The city stretched out below, a testament to the impact of quiet ambition. Rivera Enterprises buildings stood among the lights, each one a reminder of what could be achieved without seeking validation. My phone buzzed with a message from my assistant. "Sir, the small construction firm you mentioned, Martinez Construction. Their portfolio is impressive. Solid projects, excellent execution, just no industry connections. Should I schedule a meeting?" I smiled, remembering my own journey. "Set it up for next week and send them our mentorship program details." Another message followed, this one from Sarah. "Watching you give that speech today, I finally understood something. Success isn't about who notices you. It's about what you build when no one's looking. Thank you for teaching me that, even if I learned it the hard way." The night air was cool as I looked out over the city I'd helped shape. Rivera Enterprises had grown beyond my original vision, not because we sought recognition, but because we stayed true to our principles. The Thompson acquisition had forced me into the spotlight, but it hadn't changed our fundamental approach to success. My phone buzzed one final time. A news alert about Rivera Enterprises' latest project. Industry giant continues to innovate. Rivera Enterprises launches revolutionary mentorship program. The article quoted several industry experts praising the initiative, noting how it could transform the development landscape by supporting overlooked talent. Standing there, looking out at the city lights, I realized that every ending creates space for new beginnings. The Thompson acquisition had closed one chapter of my life, but it had opened possibilities I hadn't imagined. Now, through the mentorship program, I could help others build their success stories, showing them that true power doesn't need to announce itself. It simply needs to persist, to build, to create lasting value. The future stretched out before me like the city skyline, full of potential and possibility. Rivera Enterprises would continue to grow, to innovate, to shape the urban landscape. But more importantly, we would help others do the same, proving that success doesn't always wear a designer suit or demand attention. Sometimes it just quietly shows up, does the work, and changes the world without anyone noticing. Until suddenly, they all notice, and by then, you've already built something truly remarkable. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.